I'm Margaret Whitmore, 69 years old, and as I stood beside my husband's casket that morning, rosary clenched so tight, the beads left marks in my skin. I heard my daughter's voice slice through the hush of the funeral like a blade. She leaned in close to her husband, whispering, but not quiet enough, and said she won't get a single dollar. The old hag can rot. The ground tilted beneath me. The church faded into a blur. And when I looked up, she didn't flinch. She met my eyes, like she meant every word, and smiled. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, I grew up in a town where people still waved from their porches and brought casseroles when someone lost a loved one. I married young to a man named Arthur, who built his life with calloused hands and steady patience. He never raised his voice, never hurried his thoughts, just planted things and trusted. They'd grow. We lived in a white clapboard house just past the orchard line where the trees bent with fruit every fall, and the porch always smelled faintly of pipe smoke and cinnamon. Arthur and I raised one daughter, Elizabeth. She was bright and sharp from the beginning, headstrong with a quick tongue and a taste for the finer things, even when we couldn't afford them. I sewed her dresses from scrap fabric and taught her how to scrub the kitchen tiles with vinegar and hot water. She hated that part, said she was meant for more, and maybe she was. But it was always love that held the corners of our house together. Not money. She left for college out of state, came back with a husband and a sharper edge. I didn't see it at first, not clearly. At least she'd smile when she wanted something flatter when she didn't. But I always thought, if I loved her well enough, long enough, she'd come around. Arthur got sick that last winter. He moved slower, spoke less, but still held my hand every night like we were young again. Elizabeth visited when she could brought takeout and rolled her eyes. When I offered leftovers, she never sat with him, not really, never asked about his pain meds or the orchard or his old radio shows. Just kept asking where the paperwork was, where the keys were, what he planned to leave behind. I thought she was scared, afraid to lose him in her own way. But that morning at the church, something inside me cracked clean through. As the priest talked about forgiveness and eternal rest, I stood there, staring at my only child, and felt the air go cold. I returned home without saying a word, and found her already at Arthur's desk, tearing through drawers, muttering, "Where is it?" He wouldn't leave it to her. She didn't even hear me on the stairs, didn't care that night upstairs in my sewing room, surrounded by spools and scraps, and the soft hum of silence. I unfolded Arthur's notes one by one, tucked beneath his desk like breadcrumbs. Margie, if you're reading this, it means I was right. His handwriting was still steady, careful like he always was. He told me not to let her sell the house, not to let her erase us. He said. He was sorry for not protecting me. More, sorry for staying quiet for too long. I pressed the pages to my chest and sat there for hours, not crying, not praying, just breathing slow and deep until the air stopped shaking. The next day, Mrs. Lopez came by with a casserole dish, and a hard truth said she'd heard Elizabeth down at the pharmacy, bragging about modernizing the house and clearing the orchard, already making plans before the soil had even settled. She pressed a small recorder into my hand, said, "Quiet doesn't mean helpless," and for the first time in weeks I believed her. That was the morning I stopped waiting. I poured Elizabeth her tea, just like I always had, watched her scroll through her phone and talk about filing papers without my knowing, and I kept my hand steady because now I had what she didn't, the beginning of a plan. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Elizabeth's voice downstairs, sharp, urgent, louder than usual. I sat up slowly, the room still dim with early light, and took a moment to steady myself. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on the walls. I moved through my routine in silence, tying my apron and sliding the recorder Mrs. Lopez had given me into the front pocket. My hands trembled a little, but I kept them busy. By the time I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, her voice had taken on a sweet, artificial tone that made my skin prickle. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. Elizabeth stood near the entryway with two strangers. One was a woman in a stiff gray suit, clipboard in hand. The other was a younger man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Elizabeth turned toward me with that tight-lipped smile she used when she wanted something. "Mother," she said brightly, "these professionals are here to help. We're just concerned, that's all. You've seemed a bit forgetful." The woman stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, we'd like to go over a few options with you today. Just a simple care arrangement for your safety and well-being. We have some preliminary documents for you to review." She held out a pen. I looked at it, then at Elizabeth. Her eyes gleamed, already expecting me to fold. I reached out slowly, my fingers brushing the barrel. I counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. Then I looked up and said, "Maybe I should think on it." My voice was soft, almost small. Elizabeth's face shifted. The smile dropped, her tone sharpened. "There's nothing to think about. You can't keep this place up. You can barely keep up with yourself." The woman in the suit glanced at her colleague, uncomfortable. The young man stared at the floor. I kept my voice steady, my eyes on Elizabeth. "Of course, dear. We'll talk later." Then I turned and walked back up the stairs, my back straight. I didn't look back. In my room, I closed the door gently and locked it. My breath came in short pulls as I sank into Arthur's chair. My hands were shaking, but inside something steadied. I had the recordings, I had the documents, and now I had a timeline. She wasn't waiting for me to sign. She was pushing forward like I didn't matter at all. That night at dinner, I played my part. I moved a little slower, let my shoulders sag. When Elizabeth sat down, I poured her wine, set her napkin gently on her lap, just like I used to when she was little and couldn't quite reach the table. She didn't question it. In fact, she leaned back in her chair, smug and quiet. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she said, her voice light. I nodded, eyes down. "I'm just tired, dear." "Maybe you're right. Maybe the house is too much." Her eyes lit up just a flicker, but I caught it. She reached across the table and patted my hand. "I know what's best for you, Mother. You'll see." I nodded again, still looking at my plate. The recorder pressed against my side like a steady pulse. Every word, every smug little phrase. I'd captured it all. Later that night, I sat in the sewing room. The old lamp hummed beside me, casting a soft yellow glow across the worn wood table. I turned the recorder over in my hands. Thought of Arthur, of the orchard, of everything I was quietly preparing to protect. I whispered to the walls, "She thinks I'm giving in. Let her think it." Then I opened the notebook from Father Thomas and began to write. Dates, names, details. Every word she spoke when she thought I wasn't listening. When the last sentence was written, I smoothed the page flat with both hands and closed the cover. I sat there a while longer, staring out the window. The orchard swayed gently under the moonlight. I would not disappear. By the next morning, my path was clear. I woke before sunrise, the house still quiet. I stepped into Arthur's study with my notes and the recorder. I dialed Mr. Caldwell, the lawyer Father Thomas had recommended. My voice shook when I first spoke, but he didn't rush me. He let me explain every detail, what Elizabeth had said, what I'd recorded, what I'd found in Arthur's desk. When I finished, there was a pause. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, calm and sure, you have more than enough. But we need to move carefully. Do not let them know what you have. We'll meet in 2 days. I hung up and felt something settle deep in my chest. Not fear. Something stronger. I spent the rest of the morning gathering everything: insurance papers, deeds, Arthur's handwritten notes. I slipped them all into a plain canvas bag. I labeled each recording with the date and a few words about what was said. I glanced at the bookshelf near the fireplace, at the old family photos lined up in neat frames. One caught my eye. Arthur and me standing at the edge of the orchard, our arms around each other. Elizabeth in front of us holding a basket of apples. I paused. Then I picked it up and placed it gently in the bag. That evening, Elizabeth came down demanding coffee. I handed it to her without a word. She didn't notice the shift in my eyes, didn't see the calm, practiced movements. She sipped, muttered something about calling her attorney again, and left the room. I stood at the sink, hands on the edge of the counter, letting the weight of the moment pass through me. 2 mornings later, I woke before dawn, dressed slowly, and took the canvas bag from beneath my bed. The orchard was wrapped in early fog. I walked through it like stepping through memory. Arthur's voice seemed to echo in the trees, steady and quiet. Mr. Caldwell's office was small, tucked away in a quiet part of town. He greeted me with fresh coffee and a kind smile. "Let's begin," he said. I unpacked everything: Arthur's notes, my own, the recordings. And finally, Arthur's old laptop. I hadn't been able to open it. It sat untouched in the garden shed for months. But I brought it just in case. "There's something in here," I said. He used to write late at night, called them just thoughts. But I think it's more than that. He nodded and called in a young man named Daniel, a quiet fellow with a quick eye. He worked silently at the table while I sat beside him. After a few minutes, Daniel looked up. "There's a file labeled for Margie," he said. He clicked play. Arthur's face filled the screen. Tired, thinner than I remembered, but his voice was clear. "Margie, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and it means Elizabeth is trying to take what isn't hers. You are the soul of this family. Everything, our savings, the land, the house is yours. Don't let her turn it hollow." I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the warmth on my cheeks. Mr. Caldwell pressed a tissue into my hand. "This," he said quietly, "is your shield and your sword." I nodded. The tears came slower now. I closed the laptop and held it close. When I left his office, the sun was just cresting the rooftops. The air smelled like new light and orchard wind, and by the time I reached the car, I knew. I wasn't just defending the past anymore. I was taking back the future. The locksmith arrived just after 6. The sun hadn't fully cleared the orchard yet, and the sky still held a soft grayness, like the house itself hadn't quite woken up. I met him at the back gate, wrapped in Arthur's old cardigan, a thermos of coffee in one hand, and the canvas bag tucked beneath my arm. He didn't ask questions, just nodded once, then got to work. I stood nearby, sipping slowly, the porch quiet, except for the click of his tools and the distant rustle of trees. By the time the new locks were installed, the first light had turned gold. I handed him a folded envelope, thanked him, and watched his van ease down the gravel drive. Then I turned to the gate, reached for the small wooden sign I'd found in the shed, and hung it on the fence. No trespassing. Private property. I stepped back inside, turned the deadbolt, and exhaled. It wasn't long before the sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Her car, same as always, fast and loud. I stood at the kitchen window, watched the dust trail behind it. Elizabeth slammed the door, stormed across the front steps, and began pounding her fist on the door. "Mother, open this door, right now!" She paused, waited, then hit it harder. "This is my house, too. You don't have the right." I didn't move. The kettle was already warm. I poured another cup of tea, set it gently on the table, and sat down. From where I was, I could see the soft dent in my chair cushion, the pale curtain lace swaying with the breeze from the window. Arthur's sugar tin still sat near the edge of the counter, its lid slightly dented from years of use. The walls around me were quiet, solid, familiar. Outside, Elizabeth's voice shifted. "You're making a mistake," she shouted. "You don't get to lock me out. You won't win." Then came the curses, loud, messy, desperate. I listened without turning my head. Eventually the sound of her heels faded, then the growl of her engine retreating down the driveway. Only then did I rise. I washed my mug, wiped the counter clean, and stepped into the hallway. The silence wrapped around me like a quilt. 2 days later, the letter from Mr. Avery arrived. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. I placed the envelope on the sideboard, my fingers resting on it for a long moment before I picked it up again and tucked it into my bag. Then I climbed the stairs to the attic. The old suitcase was still there, tucked behind Arthur's train set and a stack of winter quilts. I opened it and checked everything. The documents, the recordings, the photo of the 3 of us in the orchard. I added the printout from Arthur's laptop, the transcription of his final message. Then I clicked the latches shut and slid the suitcase back into place. Downstairs, I dusted the entry table and replaced the vase of dried lavender. It wasn't for guests. It was for me. That week passed slowly. Elizabeth didn't return. The house stayed quiet each day, unfolding with its own rhythm, sweeping the back porch, feeding the blue jays, setting the table for one. Each night, I lit the lamp beside Arthur's chair and sat there with my notebook open, rereading my entries. Every date, every word recorded. Nothing left to memory alone. The morning of the will reading, I woke before the alarm. I laid out the navy suit Arthur always liked, pressed it the night before, set my shoes beside it. I pinned my hair back, smoothed the collar, and took one last look in the mirror. My hands were steady. When I stepped into the lawyer's office, Elizabeth was already there. Her heels tapped sharp against the tile, and she wore a pale cream dress tight at the waist. Her husband sat behind her, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. She barely looked at me as I entered, though I saw her eyes flick to my bag, then quickly away. "I believe we can move this along," she said, dropping a thick folder onto the table. "I have the paperwork prepared. We don't need to drag this out." Mr. Avery didn't touch the folder. He nodded once, then pressed a button on the small remote near his desk. The screen mounted behind him flickered to life. Arthur's face appeared. The room went still. He looked tired, cheeks hollowed, skin pale, but his eyes were clear. His voice came through steady. "If you're watching this, it means I've gone. And it means you're trying to take what isn't yours. Elizabeth." I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the screen. Arthur continued calm and unwavering. "I leave everything to my wife, Margaret. The house, the orchard, the savings, every part of it. You've lost your way, Elizabeth, and I won't let you dishonor what we built." The screen went dark. Mr. Avery folded his hands. "All forged documentation presented here today is null and void. The legal will stands uncontested. We have video testimony, notarized records, and signed originals." Elizabeth didn't move at first. Then slowly she reached for her folder, only for her husband to place his hand on it gently and slide it back toward him. Her face went pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came. When she finally found her voice, it came sharp and unsteady. "No." He was confused. He didn't know what he was saying. "You manipulated him. You old—" She lunged forward, knocking the folder off the table. Papers scattered across the floor. Her husband tried to calm her, but she pushed his hand away. "I gave everything for this," she snapped. I waited. I earned it. Mr. Avery remained still. You are free to contest in court, but based on the evidence, it will not end in your favor. The room settled again, the air heavy and still. Elizabeth collapsed into her chair, eyes unfocused, hands clenched at her sides. I rose slowly, the rosary still warm in my pocket. As I turned toward the door, I heard her voice behind me. Mother, please wait. I paused, but didn't turn. Please, she said again. I didn't mean. The words trailed off into silence. I didn't answer. My hand rested on the doorframe, the wood cool beneath my palm. I stepped out into the hall. The air felt sharper out there, cooler. I didn't rush. I closed the door behind me and stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the weight of the afternoon settle in my chest. The lawyer's office had gone quiet after I left, and now the house felt just as still. I set my handbag down on the table by the stairs and slipped off my shoes, careful not to track anything across the clean floors. I'd polished them the night before. Something about the rhythm of it helped keep my hands steady. In the kitchen, the late sun was casting its last light across the counter, catching on the brass handle of the sugar tin. I turned on the kettle, not because I needed tea, but because the sound grounded me. I watched the steam rise, curling like a ribbon above the sink window. The orchard was still. Nothing moved beyond the glass. After dinner, I found myself back in the sewing room. The lamp was already on, casting a low yellow glow across the table. I sat there for a long while, with the recorder in my hand, turning it slowly, clicking it off and on, though there was nothing left to capture. I thought of Elizabeth's voice at the will reading, of the way it cracked when she said my name. I thought of her hands shaking, of the folder lying in pieces on the floor. I hadn't turned back to look. Not once. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the notebook from Father Thomas. Flipping past the last few pages, I stared at the blank one waiting for me. Then slowly I began to write. Not a date, not a time, just what I remembered from that room. Her voice. Arthur's on the screen. The hush afterward. When I finished, I left the notebook open, the pen resting diagonally across the page. That night, I didn't sleep right away. I lay in bed, watching the ceiling, the fan circling slowly overhead. The house creaked now and then, but it wasn't unsettling. Just the sound of something old settling back into itself. The next morning, I moved through my routine without hurry. I folded laundry, swept the front step, wiped the windowsill in the living room. Around 10, I stepped outside with the clippers and trimmed back the lavender along the walkway. Arthur had always let them grow too wild, said it looked better that way. But this year, I wanted them neat. I needed the lines to feel clean. I was halfway through the second row when I heard a car approaching. I stood up slowly, one hand on my hip, and watched Elizabeth's sedan roll into the drive. She parked too close to the grass again. The door slammed. She didn't come up the walk. She just stood by the car, one hand on the roof, looking at the house like it didn't belong to her anymore. I stayed still, the clippers dangling loosely at my side. Finally, she called out, "Can we talk?" I didn't move. She took a few steps forward, stopping at the edge of the porch. Her blouse was wrinkled like she hadn't changed from the day before. "Just 5 minutes." I stepped back toward the house and opened the screen door. I didn't speak, but I didn't close it either. She followed slowly. In the kitchen, I didn't offer tea. She sat at the far end of the table, folding her hands in front of her. I stayed by the sink, wiping down the counter again, even though it didn't need it. I didn't expect the video, she said quietly. He never told me. I turned off the faucet. I thought I'd have more time to sort things out. She paused, glanced up at me. I know what I did hurt you. I know it. I leaned against the counter, arms folded. I needed to know I'd be okay, she said, voice cracking a little. That I wouldn't be left out of everything. I nodded, but said nothing. She looked down at her lap. Everything's gone now? The clock on the wall ticked behind us. I waited until the minute hand shifted before I moved. I walked over to the table and set a clean dish towel down in front of her. She looked at it confused, then back at me. I spent years cleaning up after your messes, I said quietly. But this one's yours. She stared at me for a long moment. Her mouth opened, then closed again. I picked up the clippers from the windowsill and walked to the back door. The screen creaked as I opened it. The orchard waited beyond. When I looked over my shoulder, she was still sitting there, hands clenched, staring at the towel like it might answer something. I didn't wait for her to leave. I walked out into the backyard, stepping around the fading blooms, the late light catching on the branches above. That night, I packed a second suitcase. Not with documents this time, but with things I wanted to keep safe. A few of Arthur's old journals, the quilt my mother made for me when I turned 18, a photograph of the orchard in full bloom. I brought it all upstairs and tucked it into the cedar trunk beneath the attic window. Just before bed, I walked the perimeter of the house, checked the windows, locked the doors. Everything felt quiet again, settled. When I passed the living room, I paused beside Arthur's chair and rested my hand on the worn armrest. The rosary was still in my pocket, the beads smooth now from all the days I'd kept them close. The next morning, I walked into the parish office just after 10. Father Thomas looked up from his desk and gave a small smile, the kind that didn't ask too many questions. I'd called ahead, told him I had something to deliver. I carried a sealed manila envelope neatly labeled and handed it over without a word. He took it, nodded, and reached for his reading glasses. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked, his voice low. I gave a quiet nod. "It's everything she said. All of it. Dates, audio, transcripts. The statement from Mr. Caldwell is in the back." Father Thomas leaned back in his chair. "You're sure?" I sat across from him and folded my hands. "It needs to be on record. Quietly. In case she comes back again." He placed the envelope in the top drawer of his filing cabinet, turned the key, and patted it once before closing the drawer. "If she makes trouble, we'll know what to do." As I left the church hall, I noticed the bulletin board near the entrance. A flyer fluttered at the edge, held by a single tack. "Ladies' Garden Luncheon. Community Welcome," printed in neat purple letters. I took one of the slips at the bottom, just to have it. That Sunday, I put on my pale blue dress, the one with the tiny floral buttons I'd sewn on myself the year Arthur retired. I took the long way around the orchard, past the wooden fence he built, past the spot where he once tried to plant tulips that never took. The grass was already filling in, where the driveway had started to crack. I paused near the porch, checking my reflection in the window, and tucked a combed strand of hair behind my ear. The luncheon was held under the church pavilion, long tables lined with soft linens and pitchers of lemonade sweating in the heat. I saw familiar faces, Mrs. Boyd from down the lane, the MacArthur twins who used to run barefoot through our yard, even young Rachel from the bakery who waved as I approached. I sat beside Helen Trask, who'd lost her husband 2 years before, and whose laughter still caught like wind through dry leaves. She poured me a glass of lemonade and offered a small sandwich from her plate. "You look nice today, Margaret." I thanked her, smoothing my skirt across my knees. The sunlight filtered through the oak branches overhead, dappling the table with patches of moving gold. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Carter from the town board tapped her spoon gently on her glass. "We're reopening the Preservation Committee," she said. The Orchard District's up for review, and we're looking for longtime homeowners to speak on its history. Anyone who remembers the land before the subdivisions came in. A few heads turned toward me. I wasn't sure who started it. Maybe Helen, maybe Rachel. But someone said Margaret knows that land better than anyone. Mrs. Carter tilted her head. Would you be willing to join us? Just for the next meeting, I didn't answer right away. I glanced down at my hands, then back up. I suppose I would. She smiled. Wonderful. We meet next Thursday at the town library. The rest of the luncheon passed in the easy way of those afternoons, soft laughter, clinking glasses, stories told halfway through mouthfuls of pie. I walked home slower than usual, the hem of my dress catching lightly on the dry grass. Inside, I set the folded flyer on the side table next to the front door and stood there for a moment. The house was quiet, clean. No voices raised, no one pacing upstairs. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock. That evening, I opened the hall closet and pulled out an old wooden box tucked behind a row of winter coats. Inside were folded maps, gardening records, and a faded booklet titled Founding Families of Oak Hill. Arthur's name was in the back, handwritten in the list of land stewards. I smoothed the page and placed it gently in the folder with the preservation notes I'd started. The next day, I called Mr. Caldwell. We hadn't spoken since the will reading, but he answered right away. I'd like to move ahead, I said, quietly, but with my name on record this time. We set a meeting for Friday morning. I packed the folder with the land records, the orchard photographs, and the video statement Arthur had made. I left the original locked in the attic, but the copy would be enough. On Thursday evening, I stood in the bathroom and twisted my hair into a soft bun. I pinned it with the silver comb I hadn't used in years. My reflection in the mirror was steady. Older, yes, but something about the eyes looked firmer now. The preservation committee met in a back room of the town library. 8 folding chairs, a folding table, and a carafe of weak coffee that had been sitting too long. I took a seat at the end, my folder on my lap. Mrs. Carter introduced me, then nodded for me to speak. I told them about this orchard, how it had started with 8 trees, how Arthur had added more each year until the row reached the creek. I told them about the hand-dug trenches for the irrigation, about the old stone marker near the south edge that most folks didn't know was still there. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the man beside me, someone from the zoning board, cleared his throat. You've kept careful records. I nodded. Arthur did most of it. I just saved the papers. We'd like to nominate your property as a historical site. It would protect the orchard line permanently from redevelopment. I nodded once. That's what he wanted. As I walked out of the building later, the night air had cooled. I held my folder close, not because it was fragile, but because it was mine now. Not just something I'd guarded, something I'd built upon. On Monday morning, I was slicing strawberries for a tart when the phone rang. It was Rachel, Father Thomas's cousin, who sometimes helped him with parish paperwork and errands. Her voice was low and cautious. Margaret, I thought you should know. Elizabeth was here earlier this morning. She asked about accessing the parish records, specifically the ones Father Thomas filed under your name. I stood still, the knife in my hand, resting on the cutting board. Rachel continued. She told the secretary she needed the files for a legal correction, but she didn't have a written request or any kind of clearance. When she was asked to leave, she got flustered, left without another word. I thanked her and hung up slowly. The strawberries sat untouched. I reached for a dish towel and wiped my hands, then walked to the study. The folder with the original transcripts and notarized copies was still where I'd left it. Locked. Untouched. But I pulled it out anyway, double-checked every page. Then I packed the whole bundle into my handbag and called Mr. Caldwell. He picked up on the second ring. She's fishing, I said. At the church this time. There was a pause. Then it's time we moved to final filings. No more waiting. We'll record everything at the county office and move the orchard into trust. I met him 2 hours later at his office, the same quiet place with the tall windows and worn carpet. He had 2 new documents waiting, one for the land trust, the other for a legal declaration of ownership transfer built on Arthur's recorded testimony. "We'll make this public," he said, "and permanent. Once the papers are processed, no one, not even family, can make claims without triggering a full investigation." I read through every page slowly, carefully. My signature came last ink on the final line. When I returned home that afternoon, the orchard felt different, less like something I was guarding, more like something I could walk through without worry. The sun came in low from the west, catching on the tops of the trees. I stood there for a long time, watching the shadows shift on the grass. The next morning, the phone rang again. This time, it was Helen Trask. "She's back in town," she said softly. "Your daughter. She's been asking around. The post office, the zoning office, even tried to talk to my nephew at the clerk's desk." I didn't say anything. Helen went on. "He didn't tell her anything, of course, but you might want to be ready. She's stirring again. By Thursday, I saw the car. Same one as before, parked just up the street with the engine off. I didn't go out. I just watched from the front window as she sat inside, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house. That evening, I pulled out the envelope with the final copies from the trust office and tucked them into the cedar chest in the attic right beside the folder of land history. I added one more sheet, a letter from Mr. Caldwell confirming the permanent trust signed and stamped. The next morning, I walked to the bakery. Rachel waved from behind the counter and handed me a paper bag with 2 warm rolls inside. She leaned in close. "She's been talking to people in town, trying to paint herself as the victim." I nodded. "That won't hold." Rachel hesitated. "She said you manipulated Arthur, that he was too sick to make decisions, that you isolated him." I stood still for a moment, then took a breath. "He made that video himself. She doesn't know what love looks like when it's quiet." Rachel's eyes softened. "You've got more people behind you than she thinks." That afternoon, I stopped by the library and handed Mrs. Carter the historical trust paperwork. "The orchard's now protected," I said. "No changes without my consent." She smiled and took the folder. "We'll update the record right away." "This is good news, Margaret." I walked home slowly, the paper bag tucked under my arm. It felt heavier than it was, not in weight, but in what it meant. Proof. Not just against Elizabeth, but for myself. When I got home, I made a pot of tea and sat on the porch. The light was soft, filtered through the last stretch of maple leaves. I could hear birds picking through the grass, the wind rustling through the orchard. The gate stayed closed. No one came up the walk. I stayed out there until dusk. The following week, the official notice arrived in the mail confirmation that the land had been moved into irrevocable trust, the documents entered into public record. I filed the letter in the kitchen drawer behind the insurance papers. I didn't need to look at it again. Just knowing it was there was enough. 3 days later, she showed up. No warning, no phone call. Just the sound of the car pulling into the driveway, the slam of the door, the sharp footsteps up the walk. I was in the kitchen folding clean dish towels. She didn't knock. She pounded. "Mother, I need to talk to you." I stayed still. "You've gone too far." "You think locking me out will fix this? I have every right to that land." I heard her fists hit the door again. "You tricked him. You used his illness to rewrite everything. I'll prove it." I didn't answer. I picked up the stack of towels and walked them to the hall closet. She kept shouting, said she'd bring in her lawyer, said she'd drag me into court if she had to. But I knew the papers were solid. I knew Mr. Caldwell had handled every step by the book. I knew what Arthur's voice had said steady and clear on that video recording. Eventually the shouting stopped. The sound of her heels retreated. The engine started, and then she was gone. I didn't speak a word that day. Not to Rachel, not to Helen, not even to the clerk when I picked up stamps at the post office. But that night, I opened the notebook one last time and wrote it all down, time, date, what she said, how long she stayed. Just in case. The following morning, I was setting out a basket of pears on the porch when Rachel walked up the drive holding a manila folder in both hands. Her shoes were damp with dew, and her sweater was buttoned up tight, though the sun had started to warm the air. "She did it," she said. "Filed an injunction with probate court. She's challenging the trust." She handed me the folder. Inside were printed copies of the court petition stamped and signed. Elizabeth had claimed undue influence, mental incompetence, and manipulation. She named me directly, said Arthur had been pressured into isolating his assets. Rachel waited for me to speak. I didn't. "There's a hearing scheduled," she said, "but it won't go far. Not with the records we have." I thanked her and walked back inside. The pears stayed in the basket. That afternoon, I met with Mr. Caldwell again. He'd already seen the documents. "She's making a last grab," he said, "but it won't stand. The video of Arthur's testimony is time-stamped, notarized, and witnessed. The trust's been finalized and recorded." He tapped the papers with the back of his pen. "She doesn't know it yet, but this challenge puts her at risk. If the court finds her petition frivolous or knowingly false, they can issue sanctions." I nodded. "What do we need to do? Nothing more than show up and stand on what's true." The hearing was set for the following Tuesday. It wasn't a full trial, just a procedural review in the probate division, but the courthouse still felt heavy when I walked in. Rachel came with me. She wore a blue blazer and carried a binder tucked under one arm. Elizabeth was already there, seated on the far side of the gallery. Her lawyer, a man I didn't recognize, whispered something in her ear as we entered. She didn't look at me. The judge was a middle-aged woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a stack of folders before her. She asked brief questions, mostly about timelines and documentation. Mr. Caldwell answered clearly. Then he pulled out the USB with Arthur's recorded statement and asked permission to play the clip. The judge leaned forward. "Please proceed." Arthur's face came onto the screen. It had been nearly a year since I last watched it, but his voice was just as I remembered, low, steady, precise. "I, Arthur Halbrook, being of sound mind, make this statement of my own free will. I have chosen to place our land into irrevocable trust with Margaret as the named steward." He continued for another 3 minutes, laying out his intentions, his reasons, his clarity. When the video ended, the room was still. The judge turned to Elizabeth's attorney. "Have you reviewed this recording?" He cleared his throat. "We were not previously aware of the full extent of the documentation. My client had reason to believe." She raised a hand. "Your client filed a claim stating Mr. Halbrook lacked the capacity to make these decisions. This video dated and witnessed contradicts that in full." He hesitated, then nodded. "We withdraw the petition." The judge made one final note on her file, then looked directly at me. "Mrs. Halbrook, the court recognizes the validity of the trust as submitted. You are under no further obligation." When we stepped outside, the air felt cooler, like the wind had shifted. Rachel touched my shoulder gently. "It's over." I nodded, but I didn't speak. We walked to the car. I drove home slowly past the fields, the post office, the diner where Arthur used to meet the local co-op reps. The orchard came into view around the bend, its rows neat and green in the July sun. When I pulled into the drive, there was a car already parked at the curb. It was Elizabeth. She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching the house. I didn't get out. I sat there with the engine running. After a moment, she started walking toward the porch. Rachel leaned in from the passenger seat. "Want me to stay?" I shook my head. "No. Let her talk." I stepped out and met Elizabeth at the base of the steps. She was wearing a pale jacket, her hair pinned back. She looked tired, though she tried not to show it. "You won," she said. I didn't respond. "You made me look like a fool in court." I looked past her toward the orchard. A hawk flew overhead, cutting low toward the trees. "I never wanted a fight," I said. She huffed. "You always said that. But everything you did, every record, every call, every document, you built a wall. You made sure I couldn't get through." "You did that yourself," I said quietly. She flinched. "I wanted to be part of this family again," she said. "But you locked every door." I didn't speak. The silence stretched out between us like a fence. She stepped back. "Well, I hope it was worth it." Then she turned and walked to her car. I didn't watch her leave. I went inside, made a pot of tea, and stood at the kitchen sink watching the steam rise. On the table behind me sat the folder from court, final ruling, notarized, copy-printed transcript. I picked it up and placed it in the drawer with the others. Later that afternoon, Rachel called again. "Helen told me half the town's heard about the hearing already. Folks at the co-op say you did the whole place proud." I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked her and hung up. That night, I opened the back door and stepped into the yard. Fireflies blinked through the grass. The orchard rustled gently in the dark. It was mine now. Not because of paper or court rulings, but because I'd held the line. The next few weeks passed in a kind of quiet I hadn't known in years. The orchard ripened in stages, first the peaches near the east fence, then the pears by the old cedar post. I walked the rows each morning, basket in hand, checking the leaves, the bark, the soil. Without the weight of court filings or whispers behind my back, everything felt lighter. Even the silence inside the house, once so loud after Arthur passed, had settled into something gentler. Rachel stopped by often. Sometimes she brought a pie, other times just herself, and 2 mugs from her truck. We didn't always talk about the past. Some days we didn't say much at all. But she knew when to listen and when to leave the silence alone. About a month after the court hearing, I got a letter from Elizabeth. No return address, just a folded card slipped into the mailbox with my name in her handwriting. She didn't apologize, but she said she was going to move, said she needed distance and that she wouldn't contest anything else. At the bottom of the page, she wrote one line, "I hope the land brings you peace." I read it twice. Then I placed it in the drawer next to Arthur's letters and closed it gently. Summer turned toward fall. The apples came in early that year, crisp red sweet with a bite of cool air. I filled bushels for the market stand and kept a few for pies. When I turned over the sign at the road orchard open, folks began trickling in again. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years came with their grandkids, picking fruit and sharing stories. One woman brought her husband and said, "I used to walk these rows when I was little. Your Arthur once gave me a jar of his preserves when my daddy lost his job." I nodded. I remembered that jar. I remembered the year. One morning, Rachel handed me a manila envelope. "This came from the Land Conservancy," she said. "They want to list the orchard in their preservation register. Said it's one of the last family-run plots in the county." I didn't need to think long. I signed the form. Later that night, I stood by the window looking out toward the barn. The light was soft golden, brushing the tops of the trees. I thought about everything that had happened, the years of keeping my head down, the slow unraveling of family ties, the sting of watching people I once loved treat Arthur's final wishes like a mistake. But standing there now, with my name on the deed and my hands still strong enough to work the land, I felt something else. Steadiness. Not joy, not pride. Just the kind of steadiness that comes when you know who you are and you've earned your peace. Some people think justice is loud, a courtroom win, a final confrontation. But sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes justice looks like standing your ground without shouting, like choosing to stay when it would have been easier to run, like walking through every room of a house they once tried to take from you and knowing they can't anymore. If you're still here, thank you for walking this road with me. I'd love to know where you're listening from and if this story reminded you of anything in your own life. Feel free to share, and if you want more stories like this, I'd be glad to tell them.